Welcome to the Calm Cockpit. In today's episode, we're talking about something that's crucial for all of us in aviation: how to learn and retain complex information. Whether you're studying for your private pilot license, a new type rating, refreshing your knowledge for an annual recurrent event, or preparing for those tricky FAA exams, we've all faced the challenges of keeping tons of information in our heads. So today, we're sharing our top study techniques to help you retain that critical knowledge.
We're also going to talk about how things like physical activity, nutrition, and proper rest play a massive role in how well we learn and perform. If you have ever spent hours studying only to forget all the information the day of the test, or daydreamed of getting the benefits of 4 hours of studying in just 2 hours of work, this episode is for you.
The Calm Cockpit starts now.
Mike Oscar, runway 27, clear for takeoff.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Geeta. I'm a midlife student pilot and yoga and music and educator with over 30 years of experience in teaching high performers wonderful techniques to improve their performance, but without adding stress.
And I'm John Niehaus, longtime flight instructor and corporate pilot who understands the stress that this profession can bring to both students and experienced flyers. So I don't know about you, but I feel like proper study techniques and strategies is something that they probably should have taught us in school. It just seems like our education system assumes that the ability to learn and retain information is just something intrinsically built into all of us. Like a one-size technique actually works for learning. Truthfully, I think we all know the answer to this is a resounding no. We have all had that class in school where no matter how much you stare at the material, it just never sinks in. Or you study and cram for a test just to forget it when you really need it, or even almost immediately after the test. I'm always amazed that to this day, I can remember every line from the live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie back in the 90s. But numbers and memory items for the airplane that I fly, pretty consistently, I always have to just cram back into the one side of my head. And I'm not even kidding, because I really do know pretty much all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movies line for line. So that says a little bit about me, I guess. But anyways.
There will be a test on that later. Give us those lines from the movies. Yeah, I can so relate to that. I'm coming to aviation later in life than you did. I mean, you started back in college. So I came to it already in my 50s with this brain full of information and knowledge and maybe like a little bit of wisdom. So learning something brand new that is so complex, that has not only the intellectual side, but also the physical, manipulate the control side, it has really been like drinking through a fire hose. And it's really humbled me as an educator because I've had to pull on everything that I've ever used in music training, when I was training as a music therapist and doing all of the more biomedical training that I did for that. All the training I've done in yoga to learn the complicated language and philosophy of yoga, everything that I've ever taught my students about how to organize their study habits, how to break down large projects into small bits, I've had to do it all. And I'm still figuring it out. I'm just getting ready to take that first FAA exam 4 to 6 weeks from now. So I am very happy to be doing this episode because I need help. It is such a huge amount of information. And I'm really excited for listeners today to sort of feel like, number one, you're not alone in the constant need to study, but that also maybe there's some strategies and some tips here to help you start to organize things that you're already doing even better. But I know John is going to share some stuff that I never thought of doing. And I think it's going to really sort of like lift up my studying a little bit, because I don't know if this happens to you, John, but sometimes studying, it starts to feel like heavy and kind of dull. Even though I love aviation, it's interesting. There are some times when it just gets kind of a bit much. And sometimes just doing some different strategies really wakes up the material and wakes up the brain in a different way. So I'm excited for that. And I think listeners, you'll also find that in this podcast, everything is connected to everything we've talked about before. We did a whole episode about sleep, which we will reference later on in this, physical activity. All of that is related to how you perform and retain information. But what we're mostly going to focus on today is give you, I think we have 6 or 7 specific techniques that are really devoted to that information recall. So we're focusing less today on, flying the airplane, physical controls, and more about the textbooks, all the information that you need to know behind the scene. And I consider John to be the expert in this. Quite honestly, I will give him full credit. You wrote the outline for this. And as I was scrolling through it, I'm like, never thought about doing that. Well, that's a good idea. Never thought about doing that. So as an educator, I'm like, dang, this is gold. So I'm going to let John take away with that first technique we have to help you upgrade your studying. Take it away.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the benefits for, knowing these things is just kind of watching it as a instructor to see how well they work with your students. So the first technique is probably the most well-known. It's the idea of active recall and teaching others. To truly find out how much you know about learning, it starts with teaching other people. This technique revolves around putting the books and their notes down and attempting to teach yourself and others concepts that they're trying to learn. And so by just having to put these things into words versus reading them off the page, it forces you to process what you're actually talking about. And hopefully it helps retain and sort of take it from that temporary side of your memory and start to actually etch it into the more permanent side. We can take this concept and we can add in different techniques to studying and to learning. And one of those techniques that came up when we were looking at this was actually developed by the famous physicist Richard Feynman. And so this is known as the Feynman technique. It comes back down to teaching others, and that then teaches you. Dr. Feynman helped develop the concept that the process of teaching forces you to simplify and clarify these techniques, and then it etches it back into your mind. When studying something like flight dynamics, aerospace rules, teaching somebody else or pretending to teach them ensures that you truly grasp the material. So again, we're talking back on the idea of you're sort of pretending to be a CFI in this case. One of the things that I have found really useful, and I learned this in my first type rating, and it kind of really dovetails with this idea, is what I like to call the tennis ball technique. And so I was with a couple pilots who had already done some very significant training in their career. They were more experienced than me. And we were trying to remember memory items, and we were trying to remember things that we knew were test questions for the incoming type rating. And he said, we need to go to the store and we need to buy a tennis ball because we could use like balled up socks or anything else, but tennis balls are the most fun. So let's go to the store. And I said, okay. And so the whole idea of it revolves around the fact that all you got to do is either have somebody to throw a tennis ball to, or you can even just kind of bounce it against the wall. And the more you can talk and say a test question, a memory item, anything, and still be able to bounce that ball back and forth without missing a catch. Or you can find out that if you hold on to the ball and you haven't said what you're trying to say, you know that you don't actually understand what you're talking about. The goal is to get to a point where you can talk and bounce at the same time and never miss a beat. And so I found that this technique was really, really helpful to me because especially when you're talking about memory items in a complex jet, they're supposed to be like, boom, engine fire. What do you do? 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the things. And so there can't be any hesitation. I mean, you have to do it with purpose, but it has to be right on the tip of your tongue. And the only way to do that is to sort of mimic that stress of, I've got 12 things going on around me and I can still come up with the answer. And so again, this kind of dovetails with the idea of teaching somebody else, because if you have external distractions and you can still come up with that answer, that's when you truly know that you actually understand what you're talking about.
Mic drop. That's what I'm talking about, people. Listen to that technique. It's a tennis ball. So simple, but I'm thinking how that makes the information come alive. Because for me, as general aviation pilot, that it is so expensive to fly. And I don't always want to have to rely on the precious time that I have to fly to another airport to necessarily drill, engine fire. Obviously, I want to practice those in the aircraft, but I want to have meaningful repetition when I'm not in the aircraft, given that time is so expensive. But I've been struggling with ways of finding pressure for myself. So this idea of thinking that I'm going to say, like, be in the house with a tennis ball, my husband's in the room, we're throwing it back and forth. I'm explaining to him, hey, if we're flying along towards Maine and I have an engine fire, here's what I'm going to do. And maintain that with the pressure of telling him the procedure. Now, he won't know if I get it right or wrong, but, it's okay. But that pressure, the tennis ball, it's adding another layer onto teaching it to another person instead of sort of sitting in a chair. Okay, pretend there's a student there and you're explaining to them. It really brings it to life. And as you said, adds that pressure aspect, which is why I think when I heard you talking about a lot of this was invented because you had people next to you were trying to explain it to. I often feel that way as an educator, that my students draw the material out of me in a way that I wouldn't have put it together for myself in my own practice. I always tell my students, like, you are making me a teacher because you're drawing that information out of me. So this idea of the tennis ball, every time it bounces or someone throws it to you, it's a new iteration. So that is now tucked into my back pocket, and I have to go find my dog's tennis ball. But that might be hard because he'll be constantly jumping on me saying, why aren't you throwing it to me?
I think the Feynman technique is interesting because, again, as a teacher, you say, okay, this is how an airplane flies.
Yeah.
But when you get that feedback of, but why?
Uh-huh.
So that toddler-like answer is forcing you to go, how can I explain this differently?
Yeah.
And by taking a different spin at the same question, it's forcing you to learn even more than you realized. And I think that there's huge value in that.
There absolutely is. I think sometimes within aviation, we can spend a lot of time at my level, with our CFI or with other students, and we're in this little bubble of aviation. And I think it's useful to get out of that and see if you can explain these very complex things to someone who doesn't know anything. Even if you were talking about flying, your big fancy jet. Someone once said, someone very famous, I don't remember, but they said, if you can't explain it like you're explaining it to a 4-year-old or to a 4th grader, you don't actually know the topic. You have to be able to distill it down to its most simple essence. Another type of studying is one of my favorites. It's visualization. We use this a lot in yoga. We use this a ton in music. And I have begun, finally, light shined on my head to maybe use it with my aviation studying. So we know that our world in aviation is full of complex systems. And the more you can visualize how one button push leads to a stream of other things happening down the system, the better you will understand what's going on, especially when things go differently than you had planned. So, for example, if you're studying the aerodynamics of a plane, if you're imagining that airflow over the wings, you can imagine it, but you can also, one of my favorite tools is a whiteboard. I have one in every class I teach and when I study. Drawing the wing, then literally drawing the airflow over the wing will get that information in your brain in a different way than just reading the words. So creating these mental images helps to strengthen that memory recall and literally to quote unquote see the material in a different way. For those of us particularly who have full and robust sight, we are visual creatures. And sometimes I think with the information, we tend to focus on the words and we forget that we're actually operating with the visuals first for triggering a memory. I have found every aid available that I can use, and John has shown me a few more here. Movies, pictures, the cute little model airplanes that my flight instructors use. Like, that's why we have those out there. It's a lot easier to talk about landing when you have the little Piper Warrior, little 4-inch model. Tangible things that you can touch and move really, really help. And I have found that there are some apps that help you visualize wind flow over the wing. There's apps for airspace. There's so many different things that help you push buttons and see airflow. All of that helps my brain to stay way more engaged than reading the PHAK, Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Now, I love the PHAK. It's actually great. And there's actually an app with someone reading it, an audiobook, which I found the other day. And it's actually great just to hear someone reading it. However, the visualization piece is really great For me particularly, I use the visualization most extensively when I'm studying on days when I'm tired.
It's funny, though, because as teachers, we know that this is important and we use it with our students. But sometimes we forget that this is how we learn too.
Totally.
And so it's kind of it's good for everyone else. But then when it comes to ourselves, we focus, again, like you said, back on the words and the actual traditional study techniques. And so it's important to realize that the skills that you've developed as a teacher, assuming you are a flight instructor, those things should be sort of pointed back in your direction as well. And so, use those same ideas when you're studying because they do make a difference. And you've proven it by making your students successful.
So another little thing you can do with visualization is you can use the dual coding. Beyond using the pictures and the movies and the apps, you can take things like, say, the flow chart of a system. Or actually, I'll give you an example from personal experience. Tammy Barlett, who was one of our guests on one of our earliest episodes, she runs cross-check mental performance training, and she had a suggestion in her class, which I took, to draw your cockpit out. She said, doesn't have to be pretty, no one has to see it, but just see if you can, at the drop of a hat, draw the cockpit out. And it was an excellent exercise for me to see where the gaps in my knowledge were. But then this process of dual coding takes it another aspect. So say I've drawn out the cockpit and I have something like the master switch. The next thing would be I'd draw like a little arrow to the master switch. And that's where I would add in some text about what happens when I push that master switch, when I flip it, and actually add some words into the visual. So I'm starting to pair that visualization of the system in with a few keywords, which are going to help my memory recall, especially for like the FAA written, of what does that master do. I find that really helpful because, again, for me, I'm a very visual learner. It helps to take it out of this linear book learning, puts it into something that I'm actually interacting with as a pilot, which is the cockpit, the buttons, and the switches, but then pairing it with a little bit of the information and the words really helps. You could also do this with flowcharts. And I don't know about you, John, but like when I do things like this, like drawing a visualization and writing it out, once I've done it once, I don't often need to reference the thing that I've drawn. It's like it kind of gets it in there. It's not like I have to go back and study it again and again. It's kind of like I draw it, I stick it away and forget about it, but the information is in there. Do you find that, or do you go back and reference things again?
I think I have the memory of a gerbil. And so I wish I could say that I could draw something out once and just remember it. But I use, as I've said in other episodes, kind of the blunt force trauma method, where it's you write it out and then you write it out again and then you write it out again.
Yeah.
And, this follows in with, I think, the dual coding method. And if it doesn't, forgive me, but one of the things that I like to do when I go to training, and specifically as of late, it's been either my recurrent trainings that I do, or if I go for another type rating, it's just a massive amount of information over 3-week period. And so I actually bring 2 notebooks, and one is a smaller notebook, and it will be sort of my daily notes of everything that I think is important. I'll write it down. In some cases, it's just things that I don't even know whether they are or aren't important, but I don't want to miss out on it. And so I will have, 50 pages of notes by the time the whole thing's over, and it's all separated across different systems and things like that. But as we'll get into in the next practice, sometimes it's a little bit mixed up. And then when the ground school is over and you're getting ready for the written test and eventually the oral test where you're supposed to know these things, what I'll do is I'll take my second notebook and I'll organize it by system and then highlight the important things from the small one. And what you'll see is that in the small one, it's chicken scratch because I'm writing it quickly. I'm just trying to get the information dumped onto the page so that I have it for later. In the larger one, I sit there and I will rewrite those notes, the important things, and I'll rewrite them as clean as I possibly can. And any of my grade school teachers will tell you my handwriting isn't great. This is actually, it forces me to slow down by writing it out neatly. I find that I retain the information so much better having rewritten my notes. And the important part is writing them slowly and legibly. And it just, like you said, with your diagrams, it sort of helps encode that information where I may not have it right at the tip of my tongue, but it certainly firmly implants it there a lot better than it did when I was in class just struggling to keep up.
That is fabulous. I know we're sort of segueing, dovetailing, whatever you want to call it, inserting a little thing on note-taking here, but I can say, I don't have the citation, but maybe I can find it. There was a study done when computers first came out and students wanted to use their computers in class to take notes on. And they're like, but it's faster and cleaner and neater because it's not my scribbly handwriting. And they have found in these studies that students who take handwritten notes retain the information better and are better able to make use of it later on. Because when we're typing notes, we tend to do more almost like dictation. We can get a lot more of what the instructor is saying down. So it's more of like almost like a transcription. However, when we write by hand, our hand can't move as fast as our brain. So just the act of writing down forces us as we're listening to think, what is the important bit that I need to know in order to remember this information? Then in your case, as you're rewriting the notes, you're strengthening those neural connections between what you heard before and amplifying what you need to do and sorting and classifying it more. So there's something to be said for pencil and paper. John, you have another technique for us. Take it away.
Yeah, so the next one is interleaved practice. So this is the concept of mixing things together as you're learning instead of taking one section at a time with independent topics. And the best example I can give you, forgive me for constantly mentioning Flight Safety International, but Flight Safety International is a company that their job is to teach you how to fly new complex airplanes. And they do it in a very short period of time. Generally, a type rating will take between 3 weeks to a month. They have to cram all of this information into your head. And for the longest time, my first 2 type ratings, they had a very traditional strategy, which is today we are going to learn about hydraulics. And then when hydraulics is done, we're going to learn about engines. And when that's done, we're going to learn about pressurization. Great. It made sense. It worked. But then at some point, a couple of years ago, it shifted and they started to kind of mix those things together, because how do you talk about hydraulics without talking about flight controls and without talking about landing gear and brakes? Because all of those things are mixed together. And so I went for a type rating and the instructor said, hey, we recently shifted to this new way of teaching. It's going to be frustrating for those of you that have sort of gotten used to the traditional way, but trust us, it works. You're probably even going to feel like you're behind and you're going to feel like you don't truly understand the system. But if you give us kind of your patience, at the end of 3 weeks, you're going to have this light bulb switch moment. It's going to fill in the blanks. And so they did just that. It was, hey, we're going to talk about hydraulics, but we're going to talk about how hydraulics affect other systems and how, yes, there's a independent electrical system, but the electrics and the power all of these other things, and everything is connected because it's just one airplane working together to fly, right? And so, you felt like you were bouncing around, but then at the end, it happened just like they said, where you're like, oh, okay, so this battery powers that battery, which then, raises the door or modifies a transducer to make this control move. And so it's really about the idea that you can learn more by understanding how things interact than by understanding how things are in their own little silo.
This is like the opposite of teaching to the test.
Exactly.
But I could see where then you would get a test and you'd be like, oh, I've got it. Like the test would almost be not entirely an afterthought, but much more so than if you were like siloed in these little compartments. I want them, do you think they'll do this for me for my private pilot certificate? Like a 3-week time?
I'm sure it's coming.
But this is very much how the school that I go to trains you. I mean, it's like as holistic as you can possibly be, which is why I think in my case, it's taking quite a long time to get my initial certificate because I also have life going on at the same time. But I love this idea that everything is working together. So why not learn it that way? And I'd love to see the back end of how they put all this stuff together, because I'm thinking for myself, I'm putting together a self-care course for people who have a fear of flying, for them working with overcoming that fear of flying. And putting together the back end structure of the course has been the biggest head scratcher for me, because it's exactly this. Everything is related to everything else. If you're working on the breath and visualization and positive self-talk, everything is related. You don't want to teach in little silos. Have you found that what have you found?
It works.
It works. And like more long-term, does it stick?
And here's the hang up on this. I think that, at least for me, and I can only speak for myself, but I think it definitely creates a higher level of understanding while I'm learning it. I know we're using this as a quote unquote study hack or whatever. I don't know how much it helps me on the study side. I think what I find is that, of course, if you understand things better as you're learning them, it does make it easier to study.
Right.
I think that it's kind of creating efficiency on the front end and then allowing me to have better understanding as I'm trying to retain it on the back end.
That makes sense. And I'm seeing, for me, selfishly, I want to translate this all to me, but also to my fellow GA pilots, because what can happen is very much, I'm picturing the P hack, which is going to go over one specific thing. And I'm thinking in my own studying that every now and then zooming out and looking at the thing as a whole unit, even just to spend 45 minutes of a study session, just kind of walking the airplane from like nose to tail and back again and looking at relationships on a more broad scope would actually be a nice way to study.
Well, and I think that leads great into the idea of mind mapping, which is kind of part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of look at this, and I'm sure everybody does it a little bit differently, but I look at this as, did you ever do like bubble charts when you were in grade school, where you start out in the middle of the paper
Yep.
and you write a word and you circle it, and then you draw a little line from it and you draw or you write out something else that's related to it, and it sort of branches off from there. That's what I envision this mind mapping to be. And it's information that I was processing here says use it as a visual tool. Again, back to visualization. So all of these things are connected. Hey. And so use it as a visualization tool to start with a overall system and then figure out how that system is then connected to that system and connected to that system. So it's, again, back to that concept of you're not just learning in a silo, you're figuring out how one thing operates within another thing to collectively achieve whatever that system's trying to do. And so, it's a great way to help organize those thoughts and then make sure that you understand which bits interact with other bits.
So many bits of information. And I think a mind map is great because it gets the visual piece, you get the words in there, and you can make it as expanded or as simple as you want. And this is where I will, as an educator, give one little caveat. I have seen some students get a little bit addicted to making things like this, where they lose the forest for the trees with all these techniques that we're giving, right? They become like so into like making these complex diagrams and whatever, that making the diagram becomes more important than what it's for, which is to know the information. So before I would do something like a mind map, for me to restrain my mind, I have to stop and slow myself down and say, what is the goal of this? What is the outcome? And how will I know when I've done it? Because otherwise I could do a mind map and then another one and another one, but it hasn't actually been driving me towards meeting a goal or an objective. And I like to give myself little goals and objectives before I study so that I know when I've sort of completed things for the day.
Right. And they say that it works by this concept of chunking, which is basically taking small bits of information and putting them together, and it allows you to sort of process that larger amount, but independently. And so honestly, I think it's teacher speak for just eat the elephant one bite at a time. But, everything has to have a technical term, right?
So our next technique is one that I really need. So this is where the teacher is teaching it to herself as she does this podcast, which is spaced repetition. This is all about, which I've also heard called meaningful repetition, but spaced repetition. So it's all about revisiting the material at increasing intervals. So you'd study a concept one day, a few days later, review, and then a week later, review it again. So you're spacing out your review sessions so the material moves from that short-term to long-term memory. This is something I have been horrible at. I have felt like since I started training in aviation that drinking through a fire hose, it's gotten much better. I'm at the point where I feel like I have all of these puzzle pieces and they're all floating around me, the systems and the airspace. And I kind of have a grasp of all of them. All those puzzle pieces are out there, but I've been lacking that meaningful repetition. And this is where I think I maybe have to be more organized in my own study, because without some kind of outline for how I'm going to corral all these puzzle pieces that are floating around, I keep coming in and keep studying, but there's no curriculum or no syllabus, right? I don't have anyone going like, hey, have you looked again at the circuit breakers? It's been 3 weeks since you studied it. So for myself, actually a few weeks ago, before we even did this outline, I made myself an outline for 3 weeks of study, but I didn't add in this spaced repetition. And I think if I do, it's going to help, because I will learn a concept, I'll have it down, but then 2 weeks later, I'll see it on an FAA practice and I miss the question. I'm like, I learned that, but I didn't get that spaced repetition. So I'm thinking of the GA pilots out there. I've heard from other people they struggle with this as well, because there's no one really guiding this ship on reviewing the information. We have to be responsible. So for me, I keep like a running list of things from now on, which is what I will do. You heard it here first. I study this day, and then make a note to myself, hey, when you come back, button the seat on Wednesday, make sure you go over the circuit breakers again, and just get it scheduled in so that I'm getting that meaningful repetition. Because without that spaced repetition, I learn it, but then it goes away. That's where I have, what did you say, the brain of a gerbil? And it's so frustrating to learn all of that,
Yes.
and then to feel like it's gone. It's like, I see why students love coming to clarinet lessons every week, because I do that heavy lifting for them. I'm, as a teacher, monitoring that repetition. I want someone to do that for me, but I'm going to have to do it for myself. This is where John has informed me about an app called Quizlet. Quiz, like you just took a quiz, and then Let. We'll link it in the show notes. So I guess this works like flashcards, right? And you've told me that they have it for anything. You can go on there and search any topic, and it has flashcards. Maybe say a little bit about Quizlet. It's not a plug. They're not sponsoring us, but apparently it's the bomb.
Oh, it's amazing. I wish I had known about this in college, because it's free. There is a paid side to it. I don't exactly know what comes with giving them money, but I just do the free side. And you can literally create your own flashcards, and you can then use those flashcards, and you can play games where there's sort of, if you remember the old memory game where you have to flip cards over and match the answers to the questions, you can reverse it, you can randomize it. You can even go through and it'll tell you which ones you got wrong, and then it'll ask you, do you just want to go over the pile of wrong ones, or do you want to go through the entire flashcard deck again? And you can even go ahead and search topics like you mentioned and say, okay, I want to learn about a Learjet, Lear 45. And if you put in Lear 45, it'll come up with every deck that other people have made as well, so you can kind of study off of what other people have generated, taken with a grain of salt, because you have to understand that other people are flawed, and there's always a possibility that somebody might have a card in there that has incorrect information on it. Although I've been lucky, I think the majority of the things that I have searched for are created by people who legitimately want to learn and therefore have correct information on it. But that's always a possibility that you have to chance. But it's amazing. I mean, it really does fit in with a lot of these topics that we're talking about today when it comes to, playing a game with it and visualizing the answer and working your way backwards, going, how do I come up with the question Jeopardy style? Here's the answer. What's the question? And so just forcing your brain to look at it from a different angle makes a huge difference. And it's a wonderful application to use.
That's fantastic. I remember early on in my education career, another study that came out where they said that students, they gave them a big list of information, and they said the students who took the fact and turned it into a question that they then had to answer retained it better than the student who just repeated the fact 10 times. So this idea of asking yourself question and answer is great. And if you can have an app like Quizlet when you're waiting in the doctor's office or for your kid at pickup and you can just do 10 minutes of flashcards, that's great. It's fun. And it's probably better than, trolling through social media, for some nonsense. Although that can be fun at times. Okay, I have another little technique here. This is about how to manage study time. Now, this is something that musicians were trained to use. I got trained in this when I was in 4th grade. It predates this technique that they call the Pomodoro technique. And it was a gentleman created this technique, and he was using a timer that was one of those timers that looks like a tomato. And Pomodoro in Italian, Pomodoro is tomato. So, but again, as musicians, I'm sorry, I don't want to bust up like the technique, but like I've been training this that predates this thing being called something. What it is, you do something for 25 minutes, you set a timer, then you take a 5-minute break. Then you come back, you do another 25 minutes. You do that for about 4 repetitions till you hit about that hour mark. No, 2-hour mark. I can do math. And then you take a longer break. And I was trained this as a musician partly because we get a lot of repetitive motion injuries, right? You can imagine like balancing a clarinet on your thumb and wiggling your fingers for 6 hours a day over time. It leads to a lot of issues. So they always say, take regular frequent breaks. However, mentally, I noticed that when I started practicing this way, particularly when I really dove into it in college, I could practice for much longer with much more efficiency. The biggest pushback I get from students are, after 25 minutes, I'm just getting into the material and I feel like I'm breaking the flow. I'm like, well, if that's really the case, you can adjust the time length for how you want it to be. You could do 40 and 10 or 20 and 5. Like it doesn't matter. You have to make it work for you. But what I often find is the students and myself, if I push through and I do a full hour and then I take a break, when I come back, I can get about another 25 minutes in and then I start to bottom out much faster. Whereas if I took a break before I needed it, I can continue going for longer. Working in short bursts can really work for some things. I also use this if I'm procrastinating. It's a good one to I literally start a timer before I've even sat down at the desk. I'm like, setting up counts. It counts as part of the time just to get my butt in the seat and start doing it. And I know when that timer goes off, I get more coffee, which I'll pretty much do a lot of studying if you promise me coffee. And that leads into another little thing along with the Pomodoro technique is John kind of mentioned gamification. I love gamification. I wish this had been around. This was the opposite of how I was raised in the 80s. In the 80s, it was like, learn it, loser, or you fail. Like there was no gamification. There was no make this fun. There was no like, yeah, everyone's a winner. It was the opposite. It was like, learn it or you suck, was honestly how I was trained, which, bred a certain resilience. But I think gamification is awesome. So using those study apps that have quizzes and rewards, like I know Sporty's pilot training, you get that little progress bar. I love seeing that progress bar fill up. Why is that so satisfying? But it is. It makes it fun. It makes it competitive. Sometimes with myself, I've tried to gamify my own things where I say I have 10 minutes to study this, and then I'm going to have 5 minutes where I want to write down everything I learned in the 10 minutes. Like just give myself different parameters to gamify my own. Oh, and with this, John, I want you to tell your story. I think you have the ultimate gamification story. With your story with perfection. Do you guys remember the game Perfection?
Yes.
You got to explain what the game is because maybe not everybody knows. We should link it in the bio so people can see this ticking game. It was from the 80s or 90s, right?
It is. And anybody who's followed me from my NAFI days has probably heard me talk about this before. So forgive me for reiterating a long-standing story. But I had a student who was struggling with her instrument training. She was a good pilot and she knew her stuff. The trouble is putting it all together in real time when you have the stress of all of these distractions around you, whether it's controlling the airplane, running a checklist, talking on the radios, or in some cases doing all of those things at the same time. Now, we all know that airplanes are expensive, and so having that kind of training in the airplane is important, but you can only say, well, let's spend another $1,500 and do it again to not achieve the results you're looking for before the student just can't sustain that financially anymore. And so I sat down one day and was just trying to figure out, how do I create the stress of flying an airplane without actually having to fly an airplane? And you mentioned the 80s, and I was born in the 80s, so I have a little bit of that time period in there. And one of the most stressful games of our entire childhood was a game called Perfection.
So
And it was
stressful. So stressful.
Yeah. And you push this board in, and it has all of these shapes in it, probably, I don't know, maybe 50 shapes. And you start a timer, and it's a very loud, like type timer. And you have to put the shapes, or the little shape pieces, in the shapes holes. And the goal is to get all the shapes in before the time runs out. And if the time runs out, then the blue tray pops up and all the shapes go flying into your face.
It is very dramatic, and only a vaguely unsafe 80s product can be. Like, one of these going to end up in my eye. To say the timer is loud is an understatement. It's plastic and noisy. Yeah. And knowing that pop-up is going to come. Woo! Yep. Stress.
Oh, yeah. And so basically what I did was I created a tabletop scenario for an instrument approach. And each little spot had certain things you had to do, whether it's make a radio call or time, turn, twist, throttle, talk, for those of you that are in instrument training. And every time she completed one of those tasks, I would give her another like 5 seconds on the timer. And she would be with one hand putting these shapes in and with the other hand moving the airplane and doing these things. And you could tell just the sweat started coming down her forehead, the stress of just this process. And that was the light bulb moment for me of like, I think I have something here. I feel like maybe in one case I'm kind of torturing her, but she's learning. So I guess that's okay. And lo and behold, after about, I don't know, maybe 2 sessions of that, we climbed back in the airplane, and she kind of looked at me and said, well, compared to what we've been doing, this is way easier. And she rocked it from there. So, I mean, it's on one hand, a feather in your cap as an instructor of like, you get creative, you sort of figure out ways of doing this. On the other hand, it's just trying to find something sort of fun.
Yeah.
That then lodges that information in either your brain or your student's brain and just kind of takes it that one step further.
I love that story. And I'm also secretly glad that you're not my CFI. I know that I'd be getting any extra time on that. Please, it's like playing for your life, literally. More time. I think, the gamification thing for me, and this story that you gave about the perfection, there's an element of lightening up around all of this study that is just as important as the taking it seriously part. I am the one who will take things way too seriously, right? I'll just get like so into the perfectionist in me will come back out again to play, and everything gets serious and heavy. And before you know it, I could not fly my way out of, anything, the easiest thing ever. Just can't even do it because I get like so locked up. There's something to adding pressure, but in a way that's like lightening up, because it's this big plastic game from the 80s, and it's kind of funny at the same time you're stressing out about it. That lightening up and gamification can be really important.
My second type rating, I didn't have a sim partner. And so I didn't have anybody to throw a tennis ball to. And, like you said, you can bounce it off the wall, you can bounce it on the ground, and that works all fine and dandy. But I just didn't want to do that for whatever reason. And so again, getting creative, I found another technique, and I don't even know if this is still on the App Store, but I know I'll never delete it from my phone. And it's a game called Chase the Sun. And essentially the entire game is a little spaceship thing. And all it does is move forward, and your controls are move it to the left or move it to the right. And the goal is to just not hit anything. And the ship speeds up, and the faster you go, the longer the game progresses, because when the sun comes up, the ship basically just kind of blows up. And so it's that same idea of I am now controlling the spaceship and keeping it from crashing while I'm reciting information, whether it's a memory item or a limitation or, some sort of system fact. And as long as I can continue to keep the spaceship alive with that distraction, I now am understanding the information. Like, I know this. Oh, I just crashed. I must not know that. And so it's just another way of leveraging that same concept that the tennis ball is when you might be by yourself.
I love it.
So that's something that's worked for me.
I love it. There's going to be a whole slew of aviators all over. Hopefully, maybe they're even on like public transportation, playing games on their phone, like reciting procedures. Like, what are you doing? Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, the next thing we want to talk about is this idea, and this is kind of a short one. It's leveraging the power of first principles. And we all know that as a CFI, we have this idea of primacy and the importance of, what you learn first is what sticks with you. And this is sort of a skew on that. And it's the idea that, we have to start building concepts from the bottom of the pyramid, not from the top. So when we're looking at things that we're trying to remember and things that we're studying, we want to find the most simplistic of principles and then go from there. Like, this is a very basic way to do it, but what is a hydraulic system? What is the purpose? What does it do? I don't care how it works. I don't care the valves or the pressures or any of that. What does it do? Well, at the core, the hydraulic fluid is used to move physical things, whether it's the flaps or in sometimes, if you have a propeller governor, it might do that. So what does it do first? And then start branching out on the small bits of how it works and what parts are interacting with it to achieve whatever purpose it's trying to do. So start in the simplistic and then teach yourself to go drilling down deeper and deeper as you know that you understand it. So it's that fundamental of, know what you're talking about before you go for something more complex. So I think that that's important. And on top of that, we then get into what, and I'm going to butcher this, the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule. And it suggests that sort of 80% of results come from the first sort of 20% of the effort. So you need to identify the most important concepts because those are going to be where your brain's going to go to first.
That's one where I always need people like you, people like my flight instructor, people who already have certificates to help me, because sometimes I think when we're new to something, we don't always know what is the material that's going to give you the most results. And I will find myself sometimes spinning on an obscure question about whatever. So I think having people that you can check in with, like, is this a rabbit hole worth going down or not? For me anyway, at that initial level is really helpful to have, because I think you could waste a lot of time otherwise studying stuff that is not going to give you the bang for the buck.
Well, and again, the idea of building the pyramid from the bottom, What good is it to understand what a carburetor does if you don't know what the engine does or how the engine works?
Right.
You can't even begin to understand how those two things interact until you know what the bigger system does. And that's kind of the whole point to this. The next part of it, and I think it kind of pairs very well with the 80-20 rule, is this idea of, everybody's favorite, mnemonics and acronyms. If you've been in aviation, even for just the briefest of moments, you'll know that we love acronyms, or sometimes we love to hate acronyms. And the FAA has taken some of these acronyms to an extreme. I mean, if anybody's ever heard Tomato A Flames, that is one heck of an acronym. But the science says it works. I mean, when I say Tomato A Flames, if you're even in the private pilot mode, you might not remember what all those identify as, but you've probably heard it before and you go, oh yeah, VFR equipment, cool.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but I at least know it's VFR equipment. That means that it's done at least something in your brain to trigger some sort of memory.
Yep.
They work. And if you can only remember 20% of what you're studying, or the first 20% of the most important, and you can cram a bunch of acronyms in there, again, you're getting your most bang for your buck.
So to kind of wrap up a little bit to this conversation, we want to briefly touch on some of those lifestyle strategies, just to not minimize them for a second. However, they are going to be their entire episode, possibly more than one single episode in the future, because what we do around our learning, particularly this book knowledge, is so crucial to if any of it ever sticks. If you're not doing these, the chances are great, and we have ample research to show this, that you are not going to retain the information. So, first thing first, minimize distractions. But I'll have a caveat for this one. But at first, particularly if you're doing deep dive work and you're trying to really understand a system and you're like, man, my brain is primed, I'm ready to go, minimize those distractions. However, there are times where training with a lot of distraction, I think, is important. I'm hoping, John, you would agree. Like, we were talking about this the other day. Sometimes I will take myself to a busy, fast casual restaurant and study in a noisy, chaotic environment, things that I want to have in that active, like, emergency recall happening. Because in an airplane, there's going to be ETC in my ear, and the radio does this weird thing. Sometimes it's so annoying, and there's a lot of stim. And if I can be in a busy restaurant with kids running all around and still talk through an emergency procedure, that's a good use of distraction.
Deliberate distractions, I think, is the important key to it. It's knowing that maybe when you are, again, at that bottom of the pyramid, you should probably be in a quiet place. When you start to get to the point of the pyramid where you really start to know your stuff, that's when you start to challenge yourself with the deliberate distractions of the tennis ball, the application, sitting in public. I used to have a thing where I would take the same tennis ball with a student, take a textbook, put it in their hand, and they'd have to balance the tennis ball on the book while they answer my questions. Deliberate distractions do have a place.
Nice. So another tip that under that lifestyle kind of thing is creating a study schedule. One of my favorite sayings is, if it is not scheduled, it's not real. Let me say that again. If it's not scheduled, it's not real. That comes from Marie Forleo, who runs an online business school. And it is one of the greatest pieces of advice that I've ever gotten. Along with that, every couple of weeks, I go back through my outline for both I have one for flying the plane, and then I have one for the written exam, because those are the two things happening in my world. And I just kind of go through and I'm like, where am I at? What do I need to do recall on? I guarantee you it's going to get a big refresh after recording this episode. But having literally my own curriculum takes the stress out of it. And then when I go to study, I know what I'm studying. I don't have to sit down and go, well, what am I going to do? What should I do? Overwhelm. I have to do it all. It's already all written out for me. And along with that, I use something called a next list on my study schedule, which is at the end of every study session. I just jot down on a Post-it the word next, and I write the 3 things that I want to pick up with the next time. So the next time I go to study or write or practice my clarinet, I just pull out the next list, and right there, I know where I'm picking up, and it helps my active recall to just pick up where I left off. I don't have to spend that 10 minutes sitting down going, what am I going to do today? Where was I? What happened? It really helps me to keep the ball rolling. Physical activity is another great lifestyle strategy. Please move your body. One of my teachers in grad school used to have us jump rope. Kind of reminds me of your textbook and the tennis ball thing. She used to have us jump rope before a practice session. This was for clarinet. She would say, get your heart rate up, get your blood pumping, get all of the systems of your body working and moving. It will help you to concentrate. And she was right. Oh my gosh, nutrition. This will be several thousand episodes. However, we know that very basic things like omega-3 fatty acids, which are in fish and nuts, can help tremendously to your cognition. There are certain key nutrients that we'll get into when we have a nutritionist here that can also help. Hydration is also crucial. Very often for me, when I get brain fog, the first thing I do is I grab my water, and I have 16 ounces of water like that. Within 30 minutes, it's like my brain turns back on. Last one is getting proper rest. I don't know, John, do we have an episode about that? Maybe? Getting proper rest. We did one about sleep. There is ample research to show that getting sleep before you learn material is just as crucial as getting sleep after you learn material. I have a lot more research to share on this one, so that'll be a whole separate episode on all these lifestyle ones, but I think I'll leave it at those right now. I think that's plenty. Get your proper rest. John, I think I'm going to let you cover this pre-sleep learning thing.
Sure. And studies suggest that learning just before sleep can improve your retention, which is what Geeta just said. And I can tell you that from a personal standpoint, again, having done the opposite, it makes a huge difference. I think everybody's heard me tell the story of being in class and studying to the point of exhaustion and getting maybe 4 to 6 hours of sleep at best during training, and just wondering why when I woke up in the morning, I couldn't remember anything that I had agonizingly spent time studying. And finally, the gentleman sitting next to me in class was like, dude, just go to sleep. Just go to sleep. Just forget about studying for one night. Don't worry about being behind and just go to sleep. And I did. And all of a sudden, it was like rebooting a computer. And I woke up the next morning and, oh, hey, funny, I get it now. I remember these things. And it was such a dramatic change for me that I will never forget it, because it was everything that I had been trying to cram into my head just sort of appeared one morning after my brain did its own little defrag while I slept. And so, it's so important to not just get the rest that you have, but strategically study before and after, because they do say that it does help in that retention. And frankly, I believe it.
Oh, so let's maybe wrap up with a little talk about caffeine, shall we?
Yes.
Because
yes.
How can we have anything about studying in aviation without caffeine? I love some coffee, but I know you found some kind of interesting things about this state-dependent learning and being caffeinated versus not.
It is. And I don't think it's limited to caffeine. I think it could be anything that you might train yourself to study to. In my case, I like to use things like binaural beats, because there's actually a app that I use that generates those. And apparently there's wavelengths that are specifically used for memory and retention. And so you could argue that this plays a piece in it. Caffeine might play a piece in it, or any other sort of nutritional supplement that you might use to help, get you in the right mindset. Again, doctor approved, medical, yada, yada, yada. Anyways, so if we talk about caffeine specifically and we say, okay, well, everybody's had that night of cramming where, oh my gosh, the test is tomorrow. I've got to get 6 or 7 hours of studying in, and the only way I'm going to do this and stay awake is to just, have coffee, a cup of coffee after Mountain Dew, after espresso. And there's this state-dependent learning that says that, well, okay, that's all fine and dandy, but you're training your brain under these circumstances. And there's some research that says that your brain may need to replicate those circumstances to then regurgitate the information that you were training on. So if you studied under 5 cups of coffee, you might struggle to regurgitate those on the test and answer the questions correctly if you didn't have 5 cups of coffee. Not that we're encouraging anybody to overdose on caffeine, but just know what you're getting into. If you are going to put yourself in those circumstances, in some cases, you could be putting yourself at a disservice when you actually need that information the most.
So what did we cover? Let's see if I can go through the list. We did active recall, which was like teaching it to another person, right? Let's see how well I did. Active recall, which is like teaching it to another person. We had visualization, which we talked about getting pictures, but also pairing those with words. You did that whole wonderful thing on interleaved practice. That was where they gave you the whole complex system, all instead of teaching in silos, right? You do this whole sort of comprehensive thing, which would be a robust curriculum way to do it. But I think it's great to zoom out, see the forest for the trees every now and then. We talk about spaced repetition, which is my homework, which is to do meaningful repetition at regular intervals to make sure that information is getting in there. That is a big one I'm going to start implementing today. Gamification, hearing the tick, 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 tick of perfection. And then we talked about all the lifestyle things, which will be its own proper episode, but proper rest, nutrition, minimizing distraction, etc. And then state-dependent learning, making sure that you're not always having that same mental condition or the same condition with caffeine to where you're locked into needing that for memory recall. I did pretty good. My short-term recall is A+. I think there is so much for people to think about here, and I'd love to challenge listeners to maybe look at everything we talked about today and pick just one thing that you can start doing this week. Like turn it into action for yourself. Be able to just like listen to the podcast. Well, that was nice, but maybe there's one thing you can start doing this week and implement it into your study to kind of give it a little refresh and a boost up. I think that'd be a great idea for people to do.
And I want to hear what kind of techniques you do at home. I mean, I'm sure that there's so much that we didn't include in this episode purely out of time, but everybody has their own techniques and creativity. And I want to know, what do you do? And additionally, and this is something that I like just because I think it's fun, pilots, we're not superstitious at all. I definitely don't have a lucky shirt that I have passed every test with. I definitely didn't used to have lucky socks too, which I unfortunately wore through. So on top of whatever study techniques you use, I want to know the crazy things you do that you think work. And it doesn't really even matter if it's placebo effect. I mean, if you believe it works, then it's got to work, right? So if you can and you think about it, send us an email at calmcockpit@gmail.com. I want to know what you guys do to find your own study tips and how you succeed.
I would love to hear about that, especially the little superstition things that we have. I think some of those are so fun. And it comes back again to that idea of like having these little triggers to put you in the right mindset to execute what we all know. All this information, we do it because we love it and we find it fascinating and interesting. There's a lot of it. We're all in this together. So please, we would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear those tips, tricks, and superstitions. Let me know what you do. I have 2 rings that I always wear when I fly, so I guess I'm in that club. I always put on those specific rings, one on each hand. I'm equally balanced. In addition, if you do not know and you're new to the world of podcasts, make sure you follow the show. That way, every time we drop a new episode, it comes in. And as well, please, we'd really appreciate, we're a new baby podcast, leave us a review. If you hit that 5 stars, even if you don't have time to tap in the little words about it, that 5 stars helps the algorithm send us to other aviators because a rising tide carries all ships. And we'd love to share this information with more people, invite you guys to be part of the conversation. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening today. Look forward to seeing you again soon. And as always, fly smarter
and stress
Our
less.
one departure is Airbus 321. Traffic holding crossing runway 33 left, 3 left.